Hello, and welcome to the Rising of Chicanery, and our first effort at some form of podcast. I'm Stephen. This is my friend, my old friend, long-term lopper, Mark Cordory, also prop maker extraordinaire, and Holly, who is a member of the Rising team and also a vegan book writer, singer, dancer, and sword fighter.
I am a woman of many hats. Some of those hats aren't true.
I like to think that they're all true,
I see.
in one LARP or another. The And yes, this is our first effort at podcast, so I'm just lining myself up over there. And I'm lined up. I'm happy. We've discussed doing this for quite some time. Mark and I, last March, were talking about having a Legends of LARP show, which we're still hoping to start in March, which would involve a lot of the early days LARPers coming together to talk about their experiences. They're not forgotten. And this kind of formed out of that. We've talked to quite a few people about how to sort of sit down, chat about our experiences in the field, and pass on some knowledge. Now, I've been LARPing a long time. Mark's been LARPing a long time. Between the three of us in this room, we've probably got over 100 years worth of experience in LARPing. Well, maybe at least moving on towards that area.
40 this year. Well, 40 years in the hobby this year.
I'm 36 years in the hobby this year.
10.
There you go. So we're getting there.
Close.
86. There's a kid's also recording in the room. That's another 10 years. So yeah, we're almost there. Well, I think a bit longer maybe. But so we're almost to 100 years between us. So and we thought we'd sit down and start talking about bits and pieces. Initially, we were going to make that conversations about generally, literally just kind of chatting about, oh, this was funny, that was funny. But there's been a lot of new people coming into the to our system, the Rising of Chaos's games. But we've also seen people on different Facebook groups coming in, and a lot of people asking a lot of questions. So we thought we'd sit down and chat amongst ourselves about what it's like to be a first-time LARPer, and then into other things like how to eat in the field, and not do it out of a burger bar.
Is it possible to survive an entire weekend on pot noodles? Technically, yes.
But not if you're going to live in a tent with someone else. It seems cruel and unusual. So we're going in a minute, but before we do, there's a couple of things we wanted to talk about, just to kind of cover some ground. Firstly, we don't have a name. We want to make this kind of a weekly thing, if not bi-weekly. Regular. We'll just say regular for now.
Yeah.
We'd like to do this quite frequently. And when it's done, we'll be posting it not just onto Twitch, but also throwing it around on YouTube, Spotify, and other platforms that we have access to, so that you can listen to it again and again and again, especially if you want to go to sleep at night. Once
But really sell the show.
so
We're the
got
podcast equivalent of Calm.
we've got well, we recommended by the NHS soon. There's quite a few names we were looking at. One of them is too rude to say out loud, apparently. We'll give out a prize to anyone who can guess what Octal stood for. But we've looked at Time In was suggested by Mark. Time Faff was suggested by me. But there's also a strong case for the Rising of Conversation or the Rising of Chatettes. Although we might accept other names if people think of them. But we're going to we'll be putting a vote up on the Rising Discord to see what we end up with. We will take names from the crowd if they do come in, unless they're particularly rude, like with Octal. I like Octal. Everyone laughed at Octal. The C doesn't stand for Canfield or Cordory. Maybe giving the game away there. We also aren't sure how we want to handle questions from the crowd at the moment. We know we're streaming on Twitch at the moment, and we'll be streaming on Twitch every week. But we're aware that this will, as we say, go out as a different kind of podcast. So we want to keep a level of continuity there. So we'll definitely be offering questions for people to ask us, if there are any, on our Discord server. And we're probably going to put that in at the Patreon kind of levels as well, because we know you patrons are out there, are really doing a fantastic job. This month alone, you've got another 2 people into counselling, and we're hoping by the end of March to start getting people into therapy as well, which is a big thing. And as we've discussed before, maybe by the summer we'll start being able to pay for people to have diagnoses for things like ADHD and autism, and maybe even LARPing, which we understand is a disorder amongst many people that are listening. So yeah, so we'll be building in questions like that somewhere. Again, depending on how today goes, we'll throw that out there. So anyway, that's kind of that opening bit that I want to get out of the way. So Mark, how are you? How are you? How is your life in South the Moon?
How's my life? Well, yeah, I'm fine. Thank you very much. Excellent introduction there. I really don't have anything to add. Yes, it's sunny outside. The cats are currently quiet. Nobody's knocking at the door. Let's do this.
Okay, good. Holly, how are you? Other than amused by the two old guys not being great on a stream.
Amused, bemused, sea-mused, all of the mused. No, I'm good. I'm okay. I'm all right.
Cool. So it's been a bit of a February for us. We've done a bit of LARPing, so we're kind of in the mood to talk about it. But not Mark. Mark's not done any LARPing this month. Bless him.
I haven't done any LARPing for years.
But we keep offering.
Sorry?
We kept offering, you know.
I know, a little thing called a pandemic, but I just, yeah, I mean, okay, I'm a little bit creakier now than I was, 3 years ago since my last LARP that I did. So maybe my swashbuckling days are probably over, but I do miss LARP.
Lawkeeper only from now on, huh? I am the secret keeper of the law.
Well, the wizard, healer,
Also, I have this
blood,
crossbow.
Sorry.
Also, I have this crossbow.
Yeah, range, and not much running. I think will be my new role.
Yeah. Cool. But yeah, we've got a bit of keen on. We've done some LARPing ourselves over, well, down here in Southampton, so it's been fun. And we had some new guys. We had some new people along. We've got some new people on the channel. We're meeting some new people tomorrow night. I think we're popping out to meet some folk in a pub. This is so strange. Our first proper aside, is that we used to go meet people in pubs all the time. People PM us and go like, LARPing, and because we're a very kind of personal system, we would sit down, go to the pub, buy food, sit and chat. And I haven't done that normally in obviously like 3 years. And suddenly I'm going to meet people in a pub we don't know to talk about LARPing. Very exciting.
They're my favourite things: pubs and LARPs.
Yeah, it's gonna be good. It's gonna be good. Yes. So, new people, new game, and we were going to talk about coming into LARPing. And we've initially thought people were asking us questions like, what kind of footwear, what kind of costumes, swords. Where do we get those from? And those are good questions, and I'm certainly happy to kind of talk about those and maybe drag some more people on to the cast that have got some knowledge of these things. Mark does make weapons, but across more of a we've made weapons once or twice. I've seen. I've got some in my lab. Don't make me go and get them. I'll be gone ages.
There's one around here somewhere.
But yeah, obviously Mark makes a kit, but people that can guide us in the right direction of what's good kit for what kind of events, categories of costs and that kind of thing. But those are things definitely we can talk about. But when you go to your first LARP, it's an experience, and it's an experience that it's hard to explain. We talked about this the other day and how we would describe this to you as an introduction. The best I could come up with is it's like going to school for the first time. You kind of get to the gates, and in front of you is a whole new world that you don't know anything about, and everyone that you know that you've experienced in your life that has nothing to do with school is about to start off and leave you at the gates, and you've got your lunchbox, or in this case, a sword or a gun or whatever you're taking LARPing with you. And you got to go in there, meet all the other kids in the playground who you don't know, and some teachers will try and explain to you what's going on, and it's all a really big kind of.
So, are you basically comparing your first LARP with fear and needing to know where the nearest toilet is? Because from my long distant recollection, I think it all depends on who you've gone with. I mean, obviously, if you're going alone, I mean, if you're going to school with you don't know anybody else in your year, then yeah, that's pretty terrifying. But likewise, I guess if you go into a LARP for the very first time without anybody that you know, then that's very brave. But generally, you'll have a wingman or a buddy, or hopefully down with you, which helps alleviate the fear, gives you some back.
So that's one of the things we're going to talk about going to the first event, and that's my very first opening analogy. And you've immediately shot it down. Quite rightly, because one of the things we're going to talk about is going alone. Do you go with friends? Do you go on your own for the first time? And how much of an impact that'll make on your kind of your first event. And absolutely, I went with my first LARP. I went with like 15 other people to Labyrinth
wow.
back in the 80s. But I mean, I was only 11. And back then, LARPing wasn't really a kid-friendly thing. I got to go because my best friend's older brother was going, and his mum was like, "You're not leaving these two 11-year-olds here on their own. You can take them with you to LARPing." So that's how I went LARPing for the first time. And it was fine. I was fine because I was 11. I didn't care. It's dark. Whoa, dagger. Ooh, yeah, cool. And it was more the organisers that were stressed out because I was on an adult event with a dagger, and I ignored any rules that was put in front of me. So that was my first LARP. Forget about it. Very different time. But yeah, if you're going alone, walking into that is really kind of, I would imagine, quite terrifying. But going with friends, much easier. And a lot of it would depend on kind of, have you had these kind of conversations with people, or are you just kind of rocking up to the front door of a LARP, having read about it and gone like, I'm going to go to this?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. I mean, I guess everybody's first experience is different, and the way they lead into it. For me, it was Dungeons and Dragons was what led me into LARP, and then a flyer in a game shop in Nottingham. But I went with one other friend. I managed to convince one other friend to come with me because he had a car. We drove up to Peckforton Castle, and I think the castle did the big like, whoa, we're doing what, where?
Yeah.
So that almost overpowered the novelty of the actual LARP, the fact that we were doing this in a castle. So I guess your venue has something to do with your first impressions when
And
when
that
you
stays with
first
you.
rock up. Sorry?
That stays with you forever.
Oh
Like
God, yeah.
if I go LARPing for the first time in a long time, or I go into the forts around the Ross, it's not the fort smell. It's not like the woods. I'm just reminded of the smell of body spray and that weird smell that comes out of Labyrinth. That's kind of where I go. And you're right though. It's huge tunnels and stuff. But and you're right. Coming from like a D&D background, like both of us are 80s LARPers, so there weren't video games. I mean, you could maybe get that kind of crappy Atari pew pew kind of. That isn't one of what takes you into LARPing. It's going to be D&D. It's going to be Warhammer. It's going to be those kind of things that take you in. But nowadays, more it's video games. A lot of people come who have got a video game background rather than a
Mm-hmm.
background. Where are you, Holly? What was your what was your kind of first step? You 10 years. You said you've been LARPing.
Yeah.
Obviously, I know that. I'm asking these questions even though I know that because we were your first taste of LARP.
Yeah, I mean, I think I had a pretty weird intro to LARP above because I didn't really sort of start with tabletop or with video games or with I was kind of a very sort of casual nerd a decade ago, and then I met a bunch of people in a pub one day while I was working in said pub, and that sort of it took you what 2 years pretty much to convince me to come and crew.
It didn't help you were working every weekend in the
I
pub.
was working every weekend in a pub. Yeah, that's very true. And then after that, I moved to London, and I was in London for like 6 months. So that also didn't help. There was a bit of a proximity issue. But my first experience of LARP was the story, not the action, because whenever I finished work on a Saturday, the group of people, some of whom were still, like covered in like all kinds of weird and wonderful face paint, would just wander into my pub and sit down and order food, and I'd finish work and go and sit with them and listen to the stories that they told. And I had no idea what any of the words meant. It felt a bit kind of like I was very much just sort of like sat watching people talk about like a TV show I'd never seen. And I became really invested in other people's characters and the world and the story and how things went, and the fact that you could kind of like put characters on and take them off really easily, even down the pub when, you know, like there were screaming children sitting like 3 tables away. And that was what I got invested in before I actually went and did the thing. And my first ever time actually like crewing was at the fort. It was at Fort Widley for a weekend event, and I felt so stupid for quite a lot of that weekend because I had no idea what I was doing, but I knew the story and I wanted to be involved in the story. And, you know, here I am 10 years later, watching other people come into Discord and hang out on Discord and learn about the world the same way that I did. And it's fascinating.
That's really interesting because your first experience was crewing, and that's the other thing that there are 2 ways into physically getting involved in a LARP, and that's either playing or crewing. So they've both got their they've both got their benefits and I think disadvantages as well. Because if your first experience is crewing, you kind of miss that initial first magic of like, what the fuck is all of this about? Whereas if you do it as a player, then it is, what the hell am I doing? And everybody, you know, all those crew are piling out of the woods or out of the darkness at you and hitting you with things. But I mean, yeah, it's a good point that crewing is another inroad into LARP as your first experience.
So we were talking about like going alone or going together, and it's interesting. I think that immediately, Mark and I's first experience, and again, it's early days. We came from a time when I guess there wasn't that much.
Long ago.
Well, you couldn't walk into a pub and find people talking about LARPing. You know, it wasn't like a commonly done thing. But Holly's coming, you know, sort of 7 generations down the line, so to speak. Obviously not 7 generations actually, but and going into a pub, and there's like people with a really long history. I mean, 10 years ago, if you're just talking about ROC and nothing else, that's 15 years of story that people are talking about. And I'm really pleased that that's kind of your takeaway is that the story was really immersive, and we were talking because we would debrief down the pub, so we would go from an event to the pub and we'd carry on role playing because there was this kind of little nook area that we could be in, and we'd carry on telling the story just down the pub in a debrief kind of way. And I get what you mean, Holly, when you say you can just put your character on a pub. We're not in kit, but we're really invested as you would be in like a tabletop game. And it was a really, you know, that's cool. So you know there are a lot more doors nowadays than there used to be to getting into the hobby, getting into the game, which is nice. And there are people right now talking on Twitch and that were along on Thursday night and Tuesday night and or in our Discord who came here because you know we also do role playing and other stuff on here and community based things and whatnot. And he's just been sitting in our channel listening to us talk. And when he got here, he was like, "No, I just do magic. That's all I'm here for." And the other day, he's like, "Can I look at your character generation stuff?" Just because you know he's been listening to the stories that we're telling, and that's cool. I think that's very cool. Getting these are good ways in nowadays to. So when we're talking about how hard it is to kind of walk into an event. That was the first part. So you know, immediately we can say that whether you're going, where you feel like you're going to go on your own or not, there are places that you can come to you know girth yourself for the event, so to speak. You can come. Yes, girth. It means generally means to strap something on, like
Do-
a
Do
belt.
do you mean gird?
Oh, gird. That's right. Yes. I was thinking about something else. Probably not appropriate for this time of day.
Was it pole arms?
No, I was more going for like a. No, I'm trying to think. It's like I don't really want to say.
Really enjoy LARP, don't you? You really enjoy it.
I don't want to say chode like. Forget about the quality, feel the width.
Oh my god!
So it's all got a bit weird. This is the best podcast ever. So yeah, you can come into the Discord channels. You can come into Facebook. There's a lot of places that you can wander into to chat generally to people like us who have done this before, and we'll talk to you about the misuse of English language.
That might just be me, actually.
You think about.
Oh, it's the best.
But seriously, you think about how many options and inroads you have into the hobby now because of the internet, and that when we started doing it, the internet wasn't there. So that whole thing of learning about the hobby was far more difficult. There were no videos to watch. There were no sort of Facebook groups or anything to discuss it. You didn't see photographs very rarely. So your first in your the impact of your first game, you went in far less prepared than you can go into the hobby these days, purely because of the internet and the availability of information about it.
Yeah, making telephone calls to book events and stuff. How weird is that?
Oh,
Because
God,
we
yeah.
all hate the telephone now. You know, it's not something that we're comfortable using anymore. Which I think is fantastic. You know, telephones can ring, and you can be like, I'm not answering that. Push that over there. I don't know who you are. I need you to text me first and say, well, you're phoning me, and then I'll consider answering it. But you know, a message we can happily read because we haven't got a response to it still. But yeah, you're right. The internet stuff like that. That's helped. So you don't have to go alone anymore. And if you are a new person listening, and I mean, a lot of people are going to be coming in off the RSC channels. A lot of the new people are already in here talking to us, so that they know this tip already. But you know, if you aren't RSCers, if you are getting this from like a UK LARP post or something that we put up saying that we're doing this, then or you're listening on afterwards, yeah, come and find a Discord community, come and find a Facebook group, start talking, find people in your local area, go in the pub, chat to them. Going in blind is hard. It's not difficult. It's not unfun. It's just easier, as Mark said earlier, to go with a crowd of people that you at least vaguely know. And if you've met them via Discord, if you've met them via Facebook, you still know them. You've touched base with them. You can go and hide behind them when you don't know what's going on.
It also helps you find a genre of LARP that you're actually going to be interested in. Because again, remember that when we were doing it, pretty much the only LARPs that were out there were D&D clones. It was all sword and sorcery stuff. Now you've got a LARP for every single genre you can think of. So if you have I think picking your genre for your first experience is also really kind of important. You don't want to go into a genre where you go, no, I really feel comfortable dressing up as a wizard, but I really feel comfortable dressing up as, I don't know, a 1920s detective or a post-apocalyptic survivor or whatever. All genres are covered now.
Yeah, they'll make me feel girthy, those choices. It's going to be my word for this podcast from now on. Girthy.
If anyone can think of an appropriate title for the podcast with the word girthy in it, send us your suggestions. We're not calling it the Girthy Podcast.
I think we get all sorts of weird listeners for that one.
I like to girth my loins. But yeah, we can talk definitely about genre. I think either later on or on another cast, because I think more specifically to that we were considering in the build up to what we're going to talk about was the size of the event that you go to, because you can pick a whole load of different genres, whatever you want to. Yeah, okay, go to a fancy one. I'm going to go to a sci-fi one, but I think the biggest thing is kind of what you want to take away from it when you first go to a LARP. If you're looking for an easier experience, a lot of it's going to depend on size and depend on who you are.
Girth.
Yeah, size is important. So so over the years, I think it's safe to say that certainly myself and Mark have been to basically probably all manner of different LARPs. I know Holly's only been to like a handful, but we've both been to most genres, most sizes, I would imagine. ROC itself, so from my experience running my own game for years, we ran a very personal experience. We wanted to run a personal game, so on any given normal one-day event, it would be like 20 odd people at most in the playing crew, and like 10, 15 the crew, and then we go up to like big kind of. I think we've run like 80 to 100 player games in Fort, so kind of what people call a mid-range game. And that's kind of the biggest live I wanted to go. That's what made me personally feel comfortable. I've been to big games, and they're all right. I generally get stuff done. I generally find that there's involvement, but I can only go so far with it in a personal way. That's me. That's just what I'm looking for. And I'm generally okay as a person at finding other groups and kind of getting involved with them. I'm quite pushy. I'm quite bolshy. I'm not afraid to admit that. I will get in, I will force my way into a group and go, I want to know what's going on. I want to be involved in plot. I don't want to be left out of stuff. Wait. But again, to be honest, I find that comes from 30 plus years of crewing, because you have to take on a lot of different roles and you have to involve yourself in what the players are doing, which is a really big skill if you're going to be a good DPC and a good crewer. But Mark, I mean, I don't know. That's my experience in a tiny nutshell. But
yeah,
Mark.
I mean, I've when we first did Mythlore back in mid '80s, we were running groups of players around about 8 to 10 with the same number of crew, and they would be like 4 hours long, and then we'd have lunch and flip over, and the crew would play and the player would crew. And we've been to Empire, massive events. Been over to Mythodeer in Germany, again, huge events there. And it comes, yeah, the hobby comes in all scales. But I mean, that scale is also an important thing, because in a big event, if you're not feeling particularly confident, it's your first time, then it's easy enough to just basically blend into the background and become a bystander and watch what's going on. But if you're in the middle of a relatively small game, sort of 10, 15, 20 people even, it's far more difficult for a new player to blend into the background. You're kind of thrust into the plot a bit more. So you'll get more of the experience, because you can't hide from it. You are thrust into the plot, into the story, into the experience, and it becomes a much more immersive experience when you've got smaller groups of people. But it can equally be far more intimidating as well. So there's that balance there, that smaller events will give you more of an experience, but you've got to be prepared to invest in it. Whereas larger events will allow you to sort of dip your toe in from a distance and just watch what everybody else is doing. But it's far more difficult to get involved in the plot, because on the large events, generally they will tend to be the plot will tend to revolve around heads of factions or long-term players, and finding that plot can be very difficult. And sometimes you can just be wandering around a field and looking at lots of people dressed in lovely costumes, running left and right across a field, obviously doing something, but you have no idea what they're running from or to, because it's difficult for you to get into the plot. So I think that's it's just a choice you have to make, and it will affect your first experience of hobby, I think.
I think that's kind of true. I mean, there's a lot of truth in that, depending on kind of in those kind of games. A lot of what's coming down in plot is delineated by players, so or DPCs. So it can get lost in translation along the way. Sometimes it's done really well. You get people passing that out and kind of grabbing it together. It's also worth knowing that like, the bigger events, if you're going for like kind of your empires or your curious pastimes, well, there's going to be a big battle as well. There's a lot of you can get out there and do a lot of fighting and stuff. So if you are going along to do some stabinating and stuff, you're doing like kind of a fantasy event. They're very worth going to for those kind of draws. That's very cool. And that is an upside of big events, is that you get to go and be involved in these huge titanic battles.
Massive mosh.
Yeah, and that's great. Those are that's fantastic. As I get older, it's less fantastic. But when I was younger, that was a huge draw. Kind of you get a really big buzz going out across that field, and you're like involved everyone else. And it feels a lot more important, I guess, when you're for the whole nation's plot. If you're winning a battle, it's kind of if you go to Empire and you do the fighting there, and they've always got set objectives, and you're achieving something. That feels like, even if you're not involved, if you're not finding your feet that much in the field of game in Anvil, for example, that you get involved in the combat and you're winning. You're I'm doing the thing. It's very cool.
I'm not totally sure I agree with. You get the feeling of you're winning for whatever, because quite often when, say, the Gathering, I mean, again, they will generally end with a massive mosh. Everybody gets out on the field, and there's factions left, right, and centre. Generally, when I was involved, I hadn't got a clue what anybody was doing or what anybody was fighting for. I was just with this lot, and I didn't want to die, and that was it. So again, I still think that sometimes on these large events, it is difficult to find out the plot and difficult to figure out what's going on, even as an experienced LARPer. So, I think, but that'll come down as personality.
Well,
like you say, for yourself, you're like, get in there, tell me what the plot is. For myself, I'm a bit less like
Bolshy.
that. Well,
a bit less girthy.
a polite word for it.
I think it
I
depends
was
where
going
you
to say, Holly,
start.
you've done some bits and pieces across the fields of Empire and across the fields of
Yeah.
ROC. You got some. What about you?
So for me, I think because I started in ROC and because I started in a system where everything is very, very personally tailored to the individuals that are like going to be on the event. So, like when I've crewed or when I've run games, when I've written games, I write, and Stephen does too, you write specifically for the characters that are going to be on that event. You know their plot, you know their background, you have sort of intimate details of like their character's history, their stories, the events that they've done, like threads that might not have been kind of like put away all neatly, stuff that might be hanging over them in the background. And that gives you the opportunity to really for me as more of a role as more of a role player than a combatant, having that option to get really deeply immersed in the role play aspect is what actually turned me off big systems like fest systems, because what I found was after having been to ROC and having done like huge immersive role play where even when refs and crew aren't around and nothing's going on, everyone is still in character all the time, just discussing stuff, telling stories, like living it. When I went to Empire, a lot of my experience of Empire was as soon as you were sat around a campfire with with a bottle of something, everyone would just talk about their normal lives, and that wasn't what I wanted from that experience. And because I'm not a massive combatant, and because I sort of I wanted that kind of intimacy, I guess,
Immersion.
and yeah, immersion. That sort of the bigger systems kind of definitely weren't my style. I love the fact that you can go and live in this amazing like world for a weekend with like huge like with people making so much effort and amazing kit, and being able to see people that you haven't seen for ages and being able to get involved and do the role play and all of that kind of stuff. But for me, in terms of the hobby, I want something smaller.
Yeah, I was going to say, I
I
think it's
agree.
important. I think it's important though to point out that, like, if you are wanting to get into LARPing and you're new to it, and this is what we're really talking about as well. These are our experiences, and I'm not the biggest fan of huge LARPs. I enjoy them every now and then, but they're not something I would go to regularly. But you, what is being provided for you in these scenarios is, I mean, Mark talks about like things like Mythodia. These are really good examples of huge areas of land that are hired out by the by the owners, by the organisers rather. So you're looking at like a huge area rather than like a small woodland or whatever for your involvement. And Mark earlier talked about kind of the impact of the site. That's really important, and people go to a lot of effort to build in these places. I mean, I personally went to Empire with Tykes. I was Mr. Tyke, and we built an inn. We built a proper inn. It had wooden
It
floors,
was beautiful.
it had its kitchen. It had wooden furniture. It was excellent. It was a really good locale. And going to a place like that and being able to put those out, that's fantastic. That just that level of like kind of commitment to scene setting is brilliant. But equally, a lot of the games that are on that size, and not saying the small ones don't, because I certainly do this myself, but a lot of lore around their world, and they give you a lot of opportunity to kind of draw from that to create beautifully tailored groups inside that living universe. And Holly speaks of having experience of people just talking out of character. I've certainly seen that a lot, but there are huge groups there that are completely dedicated to 100% time in, being really in character and developing their group, developing inside their nations, inside their factions, being bigger, better, really cool, amazing, like little factions. And they attract plot, they get stuff going on with them. So there's a really big pull on that front for big LARPs. That's where you want to go with your guys, particularly if you want to kind of, and another thing Mark said was, you go around seeing people in wonderful costumes. People are going to be kind of dressed in the same kind of style. So you are clearly a part of a group. If that's something you want to have as identity, that's important. Because one of the biggest things about going LARPing when you're new, when you are straight off the bat, is a lot about empowerment, which is one of the things I want to talk about next, is how you kind of step up into your world. And there's a picture of Kit's hamster for some reason on the stream. That was weird. If we that was weird. So the yeah. So the what was I saying? Yes. So when we go LARPing, we find, and we'll touch on this in the post LARPing stuff if we get to it today, is if you're wherever world you come from, whatever part of the universe you come from in the real world, you find that in LARP you can affect things, you can actually change the dynamic of the world around you, which is not something that we can do in the real world. How we dress, how we act, these are empowering actions for people when you first go into a LARP. You find that you can achieve things that you couldn't do elsewhere. You can be things without judgment, without predilection of who you are, or what you were doing outside of LARP. These are really big things, and when you go into small or large LARPs, that will always be there for you. If you go to a LARP and you find that, I mean, this is a really big thing. If you go to a LARP and you find that there are gatekeepers or people that are pushing you away from what you want to do, or what you're trying to achieve, you should probably leave that LARP kind of quite early on, get out of that kind of environment. That's one of my biggest experiences. One of the biggest things I found for new LARPers. That is a really important thing that you find that you're being able to do. How you guys feel about
that? Yeah, I mean, I think I always have the term gatekeepering always makes me clench a little bit.
It's a very familiar term these days that people can identify.
It is, and I don't know how useful it is. I mean, I've heard it used in terms of like, the gatekeepering because the standard of costume is, there's a standard of costume that's required for this game. I think when you've got immersion, when you're trying to generate a level of immersion like Empire, you're saying Empire looks beautiful, and the amount of costuming and the encampments, you can wander around it, and you're wandering around like a film set. But if you had somebody wandering around in trainers and jeans, it would take you out of the moment, I think. So I realise I'm going off on a tangent here, and you're going to have to pull me back.
LARP, we're talking about people limiting people's access to game or story.
Yeah.
And it happens in some LARPs where people who want to, kind of control a role or control a position, just limit people's access so they can't have it, and you can have these things. That kind of stuff is bad for the game.
No, I agree. I mean, there are definitely egos within the hobby, and I think the egos of when you've got a really established system and really established characters, there can be a barrier to new players coming into that environment because they don't feel like they can contribute, or they don't even know how to contribute, because everything is all so tied up in the existing plot and strong characters that I think that can feel as a bit of a barrier for some
people. Tied into rules as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, from my point of view, I've never. I think I've been really lucky, because I've never experienced in any of the places I've been. I've never experienced gatekeeping in the hobby. I've experienced people with egos, and I've experienced people who think they're, you know, the best thing since sliced bread. But they generally, you know, the systems and the places that I've got experience of are much more, if you've got if you've got a new character in with established characters, if you're a new person and you come in and you've got, you know, like a whole bunch of people that have been in the hobby for, you know, 25, 30 years, everything that I've found has always been, they will find a way to get you involved. They will find a way to get you involved in the plot to a level that you're comfortable with. And that's something I think that we've sort of tried to kind of to make sure that we're doing in ROC especially, you know, like making sure that if you've got a new character, then they can get involved, and you know that you've got people that are going to be around with them that can fill in the blanks on plot and give them kind of a bit of an update. That's what I've found, but I know it's not true for everyone, and that makes me quite sad.
Well, I would agree that most of my experiences have been, they've been very welcoming, very inclusive, and it's, you know, there hasn't been that feel of like, oh, I'm not welcome here. There have been moments where you go, actually, really, I've got nothing to contribute to this moment because it is all tied up with other people and things which have so much backstory that I have no idea what I can even do here. So I'll just step away. But interesting you were saying, because I mean, I've only experienced Rising of Chaos once, and it was indeed very welcoming and very inclusive, and it's just a great system. But you were saying, Holly, about how much work you put in as a writer, as a game developer, in following storylines for individual characters. We're talking about brand new people into the hobby. So how does Rising of Chaos incorporate that approach to brand new players, because they have no backstory?
Well,
I am glad you asked.
No. Segue.
Well, let's not. I'd rather not get into a long thing about ROC right now, because we're talking about like new players coming into LARPing in general. And but how we do it very quickly is basically there's a load of ongoing story that is just generally like adventure and stuff. It's a high fantasy game, so you've got adventure, so people can just join and go. There's loads of stuff to do, and then they get involved that way, and then we develop their story. So there's just generally tons of background stuff going on. And we pick people up and run with them once they've started. Equally, when they come into character creation, we just sit down with any new character in Discord or in a public format, anywhere that we can find a place to sit down with them. We go through their character and we work out quite a lot of where they come from, what they're doing, so they can kind of go straight in running. Take my meaning. And a lot of the way the rules are set up are designed to kind of help you directly enter the game with ongoing plot and story if you want it, or if you don't want it and just want to get into it in your own way, then that's how it's set up. But that's just a very nutshell version of ROC.
Right. Again, you just mentioned rules there. That I think is one of the major barriers for anybody new getting into any system. Is if the rule system is hugely complex, yeah, and especially if there are lots of numbers. I hate numbers in systems these days. Numbers just got ported over when D&D became LRP. Right at the beginning, everybody felt they needed numbers, but I think a lot of systems these days within the hobby have managed to dispense with rules-heavy systems. Because if you thought, oh, I want to go and be an elf archer in this system, and because my mates have been there, it sounds like fun, and I like elves. But then they hand you a tome of like, oh well, you need to know these rules, and you go, oh, I just don't have the brain space for that. So that I think is an important choice to make as a first-time player, is finding a system which doesn't intimidate you with loads of stats and things you have to know, because you have to be able to react to things. You have to be able to react to spells if there are spells within the system. You have to be able to react to the combat and know how many blows can I take, and all of that. If that's not intuitive, if that's really tied up with lots of complex numbers as it used to be, then that can be quite intimidating.
I think the same can be said of lore as well. I mean, I'm bearing in mind I advocate for a heavy lore-based system, and I know that can be like that's also quite intimidating if you've got to get
Yeah.
into a game where if it's not staggered well. I like a game of lore. I love background. I love it. It's kind of like one of my principal reasons to tell stories is to have all this stuff to delve into. It's why when I'm doing tabletop games, it's really easy to do stuff like Star Wars because we've watched the films, we know all about the planets. It's really easy to run that game off the cuff. Whereas, but that I like. But if it's intimidating lore, if it's just a wall of you have to know all this stuff to play the game, you have to be able to talk about this in character. It's difficult. I like a style of game where it's like, okay, cool. There's lots of lore, but we're going to bring you in and say, here are the basic things you need to know. This is what you have to know. It's an A4 page of lore. That's okay. If you want to know more, here is a slightly longer bit of information that you can look at. And if
Or
you really want to go down the rabbit hole, there's
go and
Here's the
find
wiki.
old Bob around the campfire. He'll tell you with tales.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So it's all there, but you've got to make sure that it's an approachable there. It's the same as rules. Law is as bad as rules if it's not done.
Yeah, absolutely, totally agree. I mean, it's that thing to say. If you've got a system which has been running for years, and there are a number of systems in the UK at least, and they will have built up story arcs which have then branched out into characters and all sorts of background history and lore, as you say. And if that overwhelms every game, if you have to know what happened in the past 5 games to really appreciate what's happening in this one, then that again becomes another barrier. I mean, when we were doing like the last games I've ever run and will probably ever run were the Mythlore New Lands.
I was there.
And you were an
In
integral
the
part
day.
of it, for which I will forever be thankful. Enough backpacking and backpatting. But
Surf.
the game itself, although we wanted it to be quite rich, the lore didn't really go back very far. So no matter who was there were no heavily established characters because it was only 3 games long. So even if you only came along for the last game, there wasn't like, oh, I need to know like half an hour's worth of backstory for this. It was all fairly accessible. But when you've got systems which have been running for 20, 30 years or whatever, that becomes yet another potential barrier. So I think it's up to the system as much as anything, rather than the players, to go, well, okay, we need to make our system accessible and our world accessible, because it's the world that needs to be accessible.
So I think what we're saying here, if you're listening and you're new, or you're just listening, is when you're going to read a website or you're going to read the lore or whatever, it's got to make you feel comfortable. When you look at the rules and you look at the layout of the lore, you've got to feel okay with it. But not just that. I mean, that if it's alien to you, if it's new, you're back at those school gates again, kind of looking at this playground. And if you need that little push through the gate to begin with, you shouldn't feel afraid to ask the system questions. Because one of the biggest things to do with LARP is there's no governing body, there's no one to tell you what to do, there's no organization behind it, or really, there's no kind of like no fallback. It's just a bunch of people trying to do their best with a completely kind of unknowable thing that is storytelling for LARPers. So you should feel very encouraged to speak to your system. Go like, I like the look of what I'm reading, but some of it makes me feel a bit kind of which is a standard LARPing communique. And all you're doing there is you're actually encouraging the people that are running that game who do want you to come to their game. That's what they're there for, to learn and to like go, okay, we'll try putting this out. If we put it out there in this format, would that be easier for you? We've certainly learned over the years, just doing the stuff that we're doing, to just doing things in bullet points rather than massive paragraph text, for example, something that everyone really appreciated. We are later on we're going to have people reading the stuff on the website, so you can listen to it rather than having to read it. These are big difficult parts of of the approach of a lot of people to kind of coming into LARP. That kind of style of how you read things is important. But just talk to people that run games that you feel, oh, this could be good, but I'm not sure on these rules. I'm not sure on these things, and they'll try and present them to you in a way that is
Okay.
and they'll learn, I think.
I have a caveat on that.
Oh, go for your life,
if I may.
Yeah.
Okay, there's that balance between feel free to contact the organisers and ask them any questions. If a lot of people do that, I mean, people have to realise that virtually everybody who runs a LARP doesn't do it for a living. Yeah, they have full-time jobs, so everything they put into the LARP is in their free time. So if you get a lot of people asking, like, oh, I need to know about this, need to know about this, need to know about this, that can start sucking up the time for the people who are trying to run the adventure. Now, I'm not saying that they resent that, and in many ways they try and preempt that by putting out law, and then you get into that balance again of like, okay, how much law do we put out to answer all the questions that might come in? Does that then become an intimidating volume of law, which then puts people off from asking questions?
More driving.
Or do we accept that we're constantly having to answer questions for new players?
Mark, I was more driving at how things are presented to people.
Yeah,
so
no,
like,
I totally agree.
If your rules are like, so if they're saying like this law is too much, yeah, just try and simplify it down a little bit, make it more approachable for people. That's mainly what I was going for. Like, yeah, system runners, they're exhausted all the time. I am exhausted all the time trying to run LARP. It's stupid.
Be nice to your systems runners because they're doing it for free.
Bring them coffee.
You've been urging yourself to say something.
Well, I think that I think Mark's got a point in terms of, I mean, I'm all behind the bullet points and the keeping things as simple and straightforward as possible. But when like having that encouragement to kind of to go to the people that are organizing the system and saying, I don't understand this, please can you help me? It not only helps to actually kind of like develop a better relationship with your players, but if you've got 4 or 5 new people that are coming to you asking the same question, then you're not presenting the material in an effective way, and then that can basically help you to move that on, change the way that information is being presented, and give and then give you more time for a quick nap on a Wednesday afternoon or something, if you really need one. A nap is like a very short sleep.
What?
It's like a that thing you don't do.
Eat.
No, sleep.
Oh.
But I think as well it depends on. So you get a lot of people. This is where the power of the internet really kind of comes in and is helpful, because you will find a lot of people on UK LARP groups, on groups for specific systems, who are asking questions about getting into LARP, and the community around them is very good at getting back and 90% of the time offering really helpful advice. Things like Discord servers for particular systems are really helpful, because there are so many people, and Kit is a great example, who's modding this podcast for us, Shadow, who's out there, Trues, all of the people in that have been in ROC for quite a long time can answer those questions without it needing to be like one of the people that's actually writing. Or so you build up that community, and then people can like ask questions of basically anyone, which is just I think it's just a really lovely thing.
No, it's true, and
Nice.
absolutely.
Oh no,
a lot of those questions will be fielded by established players or crew who have been doing the system for years, and that's very true.
Yeah, and then you make friends with those people, and then you don't feel so alone.
I mean,
when you go into like your first game.
We are lucky, Holly. There are like 30 of us. There are a lot of people in the ROC team. There's a lot of people to kind of pick things up and feel things.
Yeah.
And they're a very loyal bunch of guys. They will, they help out a lot. We are fortunate in that way. But yeah. So we're talking about like kind of people being new to LARP, and we're staying around things because we're like that. But size of game is important. That's something we definitely touched on, and hopefully we'll put enough across to you to think about kind of what kind of game you might want to go to. We've talked about going alone. We talked about going with friends. We talked about rules heavy, rules light a little bit. And we talked about lore light, lore heavy a little bit. And both of those are important. And honestly, it's going to be down to you reading stuff and thinking, oh, that's a bit too much. That's not a bit too much. But like I say, personally speaking, I'm happy if you ask me questions about what's going on, and I'm happy to represent things in a better way. As Holly said, if a load of people are asking me the same question, obviously, whoever's written what you're reading needs to be a little bit more precise in what they're doing. The last thing I've got written down on my list of things to talk about for mentally preparing for going to LARP, I guess, is the politics over adventure kind of style of game that you might want to go into. So it doesn't really matter what genre of game you go for. I mean, it does in some degrees. If you're going for a Chthonian event, you'll just be running around a lot and trying to escape. But
And
screaming. But yeah, but a lot of the games have functionality of this is the political aspect of the game. This is the adventuring, kind of going out and doing aspect. This is the social aspect of the game. And when you go into a game, you've got to kind of decide what you're up for. If it's a politically challenging game, that it can be really hard to know. Again, this kind of harks back to lore and stuff and knowing your system well enough. I think what I'm saying is making sense, right? You two?
Yeah, absolutely.
So these aspects probably better described by because Mark waxed lyrical about political over adventuring games the other day.
Yeah, I mean, fantasy politics doesn't really do it for me, which is what can happen in a lot of games, especially when the world has been established for a long time. That politics comes into it.
Yeah, we don't mean like out of character politics.
No.
We
I mean,
mean
we've
like
got enough real politics in the world. I'm talking about if you then have to engage in Throd, son of Bod, son of Girth, and the
Son of Girth. There we go.
Yeah,
Sorted the title.
If there's a lot of that, I mean, it does leave me cold, to be honest.
I think to cover that,
but other people love it.
Expected, isn't it? It's if you go into a game, you're expected to do a thing. That's kind of always a big turn off for me. If I look at a list of, I go into a game and you're expected to be involved in this aspect of stuff. It's like, I don't like to be pushed into doing stuff without kind of a. Anyway.
Well then,
go on.
Sorry, I was just going to say that there are a number of games systems where it's PvP, player versus player, where actually it just seems to be entirely about players being political with other players, which is an entire branch of LARP which I have never really got into. But that's another thing where it's entirely politics.
Yeah, that's kind of what I mean. It's like I'm trying to phrase this better. I don't like going to a game where I walk in the front door and I'm not really expecting to do anything, and it's not well signposted that I'm supposed to be being a very political character. That kind of stuff. I hate kind of. Well, what? You didn't mention this before I got here. I turned up with all these axes, or equally, the other way around. I didn't bring any weapons. I thought I was going to be like kind of a diplomat. There's no diplomats here. Okay. So I could use this grass to attack people. I find that frustrating, obviously, but I'm being told we're almost out of time. So yeah, this has been our very first effort at a podcast sort of /chat/ kind of going for bits and pieces. We knew this would be talky talks backwards and forwards, and we expect to get better at it. There are things that we wanted to talk about to do with, and we're going to overrun a tiny amount. I think.
There's a guy just trying to deliver something. Just you carry on. I'm just going to knock on the window.
So Mark works in an abattoir where the dead bodies that have been killed by various gangsters are delivered, and so he can't leave them. He has to collect them.
Yeah, they attract birds and cats. Gets messy.
Great. What can I think of to say in response to that there, track birds and cats? I hate those. Yeah, so maybe we're going to talk about like post-event, which will probably kind of be part of our conversation for next time. Because coming out of a LARP event for the first time, if you were going to go to one before now and next time we talk, that's also difficult. Post-LARP blues is a big thing. If we talked a little bit about empowerment, and we talked a little bit about how you can affect a world when you are LARPing in a way that you can't affect the world when you leave. And also, you know, your friends, stuff just doesn't matter anymore. You can relax, you can have fun. There's a lot to LARPing that is more than LARPing. And when you leave, it can be, it can hit you really hard. And that's what a lot of people aren't prepared for when they first LARP, and it's difficult to kind of get out of that. But we can talk about that next time. LARP bleed, post LARP blues, how you kind of keep in touch with people outside of the event, getting ready for your next event, that kind of thing. That's only a tiny amount of kind of prepping for your first LARP, and we didn't really tell you how to prep for your first LARP. We just discussed how we think these factors might affect you, and gave you a tiny nuggets of our experience.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was useful. I would like to hope it was useful. It was nice to talk about it, because I don't get time to talk about it a lot.
Well, same here. I mean, it's the more you scratch the surface of the subject, the more you go, oh, we need to talk about that as well. Oh, that leads on to that, and there's loads of tangents I could have gone off on, which in the same ballpark. So thanks for keeping me online.
I tried.
For tangents.
So we did have a short kind of to-do list to talk about today, which I kept referring to, and we'll definitely kind of plan one out better for next time, assuming anyone ever wants to hear us talk about this stuff again. We do make some noise somewhere, and we'll make that happen. But in the meantime, until next time, I've been Stephen, this has been Mark, this has been Holly, and hopefully we will get to talk to you again soon with an actually named podcast. And when this goes up somewhere else in the world, there'll be some music, but there's not at the moment.
Girth.
Yes, guys. Girth.
Girth.